All right, this is part 3 of our week 7 lectures. We just got done talking about the stages of writing and spelling development, which are important for your role as an educator, as a practitioner, as a reading specialist, being able to identify what stage of development the student is in and being able to plan next steps for instruction and intervention. And also important for our final, where I guarantee you there will be a sample of student writing that you will need to analyze for spelling quote-unquote errors to determine the level of spelling stage. Before we move into how you should go about assessing writing and spelling this week, I would like to briefly touch on the synchrony of literacy development, which is very related to the interactive view of reading and writing. So when teachers conduct word study with students, they are addressing learning needs in all areas of literacy. So when you're teaching them about the spelling patterns, the phonics patterns, that not only helps them in decoding, reading, word recognition, but also helps them in spelling, orthography, and writing. So development in one area relates to development in the other areas. So reading, writing, and spelling development all advance in a stage-like progression and are integrally related. There's an interaction there. So this chart kind of shows you exactly that, the synchrony of reading and writing development. So up here we have the person who's the emergent speller and emergent reader, also thought of the as pre-reading stage, logographic stage, pre-alphabetic, selective cue, depending on who you're looking at for what this stage is called. Then from there you move into letter name alphabetic, beginning reader, also known as the alphabetic stage, the initial reading and decoding stage. Then you go into within word for spelling, transitional reader. So you can kind of see the progression here from where they're just getting familiarity with the alphabetic principle to noting patterns to really knowing meaning. I actually prefer this chart and suggest you print this out, but this comes from Words Their Way and it shows you the synchrony of literacy development. So here are the reading stages: emergent, beginning, transitional, intermediate, advanced, and then the writing stages for emergent, beginning, blah, blah, blah. All right, and then here it shows you the spelling stages and how they progress. So it gives you an example of the word and it shows you how the word progresses through the stages, and then bed is accomplished by the within word pattern, and then it kind of shows you the type of word they would be spelling for these more complex levels of spelling. So we'll let you take a look at this for a second, but it's great because it shows you not only all these different stages in one handy spot, but it also gives you the layers of orthography. So here's where they're really mastering the alphabet and the sounds. Then here's where they're starting to note patterns and apply patterns, sometimes even overgeneralizing that pattern like of the magic E. And then here's where they're starting to do more meaning work. All right, let's talk about how to assess these processes. And first of all, why do we even want to assess them? First of all, word study is not a one-size-fits-all program of instruction that begins in the same place for all learners. Therefore, you need to match the needs of the child to the instruction you're giving, and the only way to do that is by diagnosing the child's spelling abilities. And through doing that, you can determine their instructional level so that you can teach to that level. Zone of Proximal Development, Vygotsky. Sawyer et al. Reported that a child's score on a developmental spelling inventory was a more powerful predictor of decoding than actually phonemic awareness tasks, and we'll talk about why that might be in a minute. So how exactly do you go about assessing spelling and writing? Well, first, by observing the students' writing. Second, by observing their reading, since as we saw, they're very interrelated, interconnected, interactive. And then conduct a qualitative spelling inventory. So now I'm going to go through each of those parts. Together, all three of these ways for gathering information provide a rich collection of information. Then you can use corroborating evidence to place the student on the continuum that I just showed you. So this takes into account the interactive and the integrated approach and how the reading behavior should be in synchrony with the writing behavior. So if you go all the way back to the first weeks of this class, we looked at the IRA standards for reading assessment, and we talked about how we want to do assessments that examine reading as a holistic process and looking at students' reading and writing to take into account how they are developing in both of those areas would be very supportive of those standards. So basically, I am encouraging you to not only look at the students' writing and spelling, but also see how it relates to their reading as well. So, how to observe students' writing? Well, the first way would be to look at writing samples, which provide information about their knowledge of the sound symbol system, their understanding of the functions of writing. The most authentic way to collect a writing sample would be to have them bring in a sample assignment they are working on in the classroom. I know a couple of people had students bring in assignments during some of their sessions. So if you retained those, you can use those and kind of take a look to see loosely where they fit in the stages of spelling development. You can also see page 284 for an observation checklist you could use to evaluate the writing. Again, classroom practice and the teacher's values have a huge impact on writing attitudes and performance. So for that reason, it's a good idea to see what kind of assignments are happening in the classroom and what is the teacher placing a great deal of value on. Informal classroom-based assessment for writing, you would want to examine a written product for composition and mechanics. Samples of written work should be gathered as evidence for the products children create and the process they use. This would be things like daily work samples, journal entries, work from Writer's Workshop. Student writings, this is a quote from chapter 8, which is informal assessment. Student writings, especially unedited rough drafts, are a gold mine of information about orthographic knowledge. So seeing if you could maybe get your hands on some of those rough drafts, because you can really see their initial attempt at, writing some of these more complex words or how they go about doing that. You could also do more of a structured writing assessment, like a dictated story, which provides information about oral language, print awareness, knowledge of print conventions, and story structure. This is where you have the student draw a picture, then write any portion of the story they can. Then the child dictates the story to the teacher, who writes it exactly as produced. So this is appropriate for some of your more emergent younger students where they're drawing the picture and writing as much as they can, but ultimately having them dictate the story to you so you can kind of analyze that for story structure and oral language because they're not able to produce a full story on their own. You can use figure 716 on page 298 to analyze the dictated story as well. So again, this would be a good assessment for your younger students who are in that emergent stage of writing where they're not going to be able to produce a full writing sample independently. Other structured writing assessments include prompted writing activities, asking the child to write anything he or she knows how to write. Another activity mentioned in the book is All the Words I Know, having the student make a list of all the words they know how to write. I would prefer that you didn't do this because you can't see their story composition or how they're putting together multiple sentences. So this might be appropriate for your younger kids, but I'd rather for them you do a dictated story. And then other students who do have some proficiency in writing, having them write to a prompt or writing about something they know. Supported writing, that is when the child draws a picture, then writes about it, or you can even brainstorm with the child to generate several possible topics. So, in order to assess the student's writing, you can review work they've already produced. And then holistic scoring would be one score based on an overall impression. Analytic scoring would be you use a whole piece, but you judge it in terms of subcomponents. So scores and points are awarded for each subcomponent. So an example of that would be like one of the 6 traits rubrics or a rubric on page 359, or using an observation checklist to evaluate the product, but also to examine the writer at work. So your job this week is going to be to collect some sort of writing sample from your student and then to evaluate it either using holistic scoring, analytic scoring, or an observation checklist. So the writing sample itself is more of an informal classroom-based assessment, and then by scoring it with a rubric or a checklist, you're adding a structured element to that. All right, limitations of observing students' writing. Some students are anxious about spelling and only use words they know how to spell. Students might be using resources in the room like word walls, dictionaries, or the person nearby. You just want to make note of that if they are doing that. Or if the student is so absorbed in getting their ideas out, they may not pay attention to spelling and make excessive errors. So those are some things to keep in mind as you're giving your writing assessment to include in your reflection about factors that may impact your results. Here is a sample of something you could do. You could give the student a prompt. Think about a time when you had a lot of fun. Where were you? Who were you with and what happened? Why was this event important? Write a personal narrative or story about a time that you had a lot of fun. And my student wrote, look, it's Chuck E. Cheese. I went into Chuck E. Cheese with my mom, Linda, Corey, and Stephanie. We played lots of kinds of games like the slide. My family ate pizza with pepperoni and pineapple. It was delicious and good. It was important because it was the best birthday ever of my whole life. I wish I lived at Chuck E. Cheese. So this would be a way to collect a writing sample, which you could evaluate on traits of writing like ideas, organization, or even just using this to look at things like spelling. So for example, I see, A blanky she's got with 8 and slide, so it looks like she's very aware of how to use that the long vowel with the silent E, to the point where even in the word kinds, which she puts an E on. So she's overgeneralizing that rule. And then looking at words like pepperoni, pineapple, delicious. So in looking at the errors that this student created, I think she's somewhere in the late within word pattern spelling, because she does know a lot of these long vowel patterns and rules, but she's overgeneralizing, but is doing a pretty good job with multisyllabic words like delicious, just missing, that second or that last syllable there, and an important, missing that A there. And then this would be a way that you could score the writing sample using a rubric, looking at, does she have an understanding of narrative? Does she have developed ideas with supporting details? Is there a consistent point of view and focus? What are the conventions like? How about sentence fluency, word choice, voice? So that would be a sample assessment you can conduct. Next, we will talk about how to observe students reading when we come back.